He stood alone on the cold, uneven stones of the tower green, the distant clatter of armor and hushed footsteps echoing through the grey walls. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, brother to Anne Boleyn, felt that chill not as wind but as a living spectre of betrayal closing around him. His hands trembled not from fear of death he had faced courts and parliaments, but from the grotesque intimacy of this particular fate. The blade would strike at the very base of his skull, and though executioners prided themselves on swift justice, modern accounts sanitize the horror of those final moments. All contemporary chroniclers speak of dignity and composure, as though a man could meet such an end without a drop of terror staining his conscience. Yet scientific dissections of surviving accounts hint at a different truth. Eyes might blink in the executioner's block lips attempt speech, even as blood pooled beneath moments of conscious agonizing realization that defy the popular facade of a clean beheading. It is this hidden spectacle, the cruel intersection of biology and politics, that we will uncover. Born around 1504 into the ambitious Boleyn family, George was celebrated in youth as handsome, witty, and fiercely loyal. His sister Anne's meteoric rise to queenship cast a golden glow upon him, yet the same court that lavished him with favor nursed darker appetites. Factions vied for influence, alliances shifted like quicksand, and George's every gesture was measured against tides of suspicion. To understand his end, we must first grasp the perilous world in which he moved, a world where whispers of treason carried the weight of a soldier's sword, and a single misstep could become a public spectacle of blood and shame. What truly transpired in May of 1536 transcends simple betrayal. Contextual politics masked deeper currents. The King Henry VIII, desperate for a male heir and increasingly unsettled by Anne's refusal to conform, used scandal as a weapon. The ruthless efficiency of Tudor justice turned private whispers into damning evidence. George Boleyn, once celebrated for his oratory and cultured manners, found himself accused of incest, adultery, and treason. All charges that once lodged demanded only his head for confirmation. This narrative, however, has been sanitized by time and tradition. We are told he lost his courage, that he walked to the scaffold, bravely, phrases too tidy for what must have been a psychological bloodletting. The truth we seek lies beneath layers of courtly prose, the terror in his throat, the pounding of his heart as he knelt beneath the axe, the last realization that those who once hailed him now recoiled at his feet. It is a scene of raw humanity, at once horrifying and deeply compelling. In recounting George's final hours, we challenge the mainstream perspective that flattens suffering into decorous legend. We will breathe life into the shadows of history, revealing the physical and emotional torment that punctuated his last conscious heartbeat. Through vivid description and unflinching analysis, we will summon not only the man who died, but the world that slaughtered him, a world where power and paranoia conspired in a deadly dance. Prepare yourself for an unvarnished descent into Tudor tragedy. No longer will we accept the sanitized spectacle. Instead, we will confront the scientific horror of conscious decapitation and the human story of George Boleyn's final stand. His death was not a mere formality, but a grim testament to the fragility of favor and the brutality of power. And so our journey begins in the cold shadow of the scaffold, with George Boleyn's fate hanging poised between life's last breath and history's unyielding blade. George Boleyn's final days unfolded as a torment far beyond the sterile court records. In the glittering halls of Whitehall and the stifling chambers of the Tower, whispers spoke of a man unraveling under invisible wounds. Physically, he appeared hale, his posture erect, his fine garments unmarred, but beneath that composed exterior lay a tempest of dread. Insomnia plagued him each night, stretching interminable as he lay on coarse straw ears, straining for the footfalls of guards or the dreaded rattle of chains. In his mind, the voices of enemies merged with echoes of his own doubts, until reality folded in on itself. His health, once robust, began to fail under the weight of psychological pressure. Accounts of Tudor medicine tell of herbal potions and bloodletting, but George refused most treatments, convinced they served to dull his senses rather than heal. He paced his cell, the stones cold through thin slippers, reciting Latin prayers with shaking lips. A persistent cough, likely born of stress and damp air, tore through him at random hours, leaving him gasping and drenched in sweat. His hands trembled as he gripped the bars, the fine rings of his nobility seeming grotesque against the coarse iron. The physical agony was matched by an emotional breakdown. Letters smuggled to his sister described nightmares of severed heads rolling like billiard balls, of an unseen hand tightening its grip around his heart. Politically, George stood at the crossroads of a collapsing world. His sister Anne, once the center of Henry's affections, watched helplessly from her own place of peril. Rival factions in the court seized upon his arrest as a means to cripple the Boleyn faction entirely. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, orchestrated the inquest with surgical precision, extracting testimony through intimidation and veiled threats. Trials were swift, and in Tudor England, swift often meant silent. Prisoners rarely saw their accusers, evidence arrived secondhand, and judges nodded curtly as verdicts were read. George's keen mind, celebrated for eloquence, found no purchase here. Every rhetorical flourish was twisted into damning implication. Psychologically, the ordeal eroded his spirit. Once a celebrated poet and diplomat, George found that words no longer served him. Every memory of courtly triumph became tainted. His victory in arranging alliances in France, his witty exchange of verses with fellow courtiers, each now replayed as cruel mockery. Regret and guilt gnawed at him. Had he ever truly protected his sister, or had his own ambition, his pride in her rise, sealed both their fates? In his darkest moments he saw Anne's face, peering back at him from the damp walls, her eyes wide with reproach. He whispered apologies into the darkness, though no answer came, but the drip of water and the rats' soft scuttling. Amid this decay, rumors swirled of attempts to break his resolve. Guards claimed he had tried to bribe them, others that he sought to threaten fellow prisoners into false testimony. The truth is impossible to untangle now. Some whispers may have been his fevered imaginings, while others were deliberate fabrications to justify harsher treatment. Reports suggest that his food was occasionally withheld, a strategy meant to starve both body and soul. He grew gaunt, his cheekbones protruding beneath pallid skin. In the meager light that filtered through a narrow window, he looked as though carved from marble, pale, rigid, yet impossibly fragile. Despite the isolation, alliances persisted. A sympathetic jailer smuggled breadcrumbs and news of the outside world. The king's mood darkening the courtiers jockeying for position, Anne's own trial looming closer. With each fragment of information, George felt both kinship and despair. He wrote a final petition to the king beseeching mercy, invoking past loyalties and folded favors. Yet those words never reached Henry's ear. Intercepted by Cromwell's spies, they served only to reinforce the court's narrative of unrepentant guilt. By early May, the walls of his cell seemed to close upon him. He began to speak aloud to shadows, debating his innocence and arguing with accusations that had no tangible voice. The once vibrant man, known for his articulate debates, in the king's presence now conversed only with phantoms. His mental state teetered on the edge of collapse, the boundary between truth and hallucination dissolving. At night he prayed for deliverance, not from death, but from the relentless torment that preceded it. Yet the only deliverance on offer would come at the slice of an executioner's sword. And yet amidst this decay, a flicker of resolution remained. On the eve of his trial, George refused to beg. He stood before judges who had long since decided his fate, his voice quavering but defiant as he proclaimed innocence. The court moved onward with chilling efficiency, a tomb-like hall, jurors gazing downward, parchment rustling as they recorded verdict. Guilty. The word echoed in George's ears like thunder striking dead air. This verdict sealed not only George's fate, but also that of his lineage. The Boleyn family, once poised to ascend alongside a queen, now tumbled toward disgrace. Their enemies, brothers Carew and Norfolk, smiled behind veiled expressions of regret. Their triumph, built upon a scaffold of accusations and coerced confessions, for George the personal and the political had merged into a single fatal reality. Innocence meant nothing in a world ruled by fear and ambition. Yet as the echoes of his verdict faded, a final tension held the court in uneasy silence. For though the sentence had been pronounced, the true horror awaited the blade's descent, the moment of conscious violation when mind and body collided in instant agony. It was this final agony, the taut moment between accusation and execution, that history would blot out, sanitizing the scene into a tableau of grace under pressure. Like a body braced for the surgeon's knife, George prepared himself for that irreversible moment. He polished his doublet in dim candlelight as though for a noble portrait, and whispered to himself stoic phrases drawn from classical heroes. In the hushed pre-dawn calm he offered what dignity remained an act of defiance against those who had already stolen everything else. In these last hours, the convergence of sickness, paranoia, political machination, and raw human defiance reached its peak. George Boleyn stood at the threshold, where flesh and soul parted ways, his story poised to enter the merciless machinery of Tudor justice. And though his breath still rose and fell, each heartbeat brought him closer to the blade, and to the moment when the world, for a single, terrible instant, would glimpse the truth of his suffering. Dawn's first light crept into the courtyard with a cruel indifference, illuminating the scaffold that awaited George Boleyn like a silent predator. The executioner's block lay cold and unadorned, its polished surface reflecting the pale sky. No ceremonial flourish marked this morning. A handful of somber guards and a stoic priest were the sole witnesses. Yet in that stark simplicity lay the gravest horror, a man confronting the final breach between mind and body, at the mercy of a blade sworn to sever both flesh and consciousness. George stepped forward, each footfall echoing ominously against the stone. His doublet, once vibrant in courtly hues, had faded to a muted gray from days in the damp cell. He bore no hood. The crown spared him that last mercy. The executioner, a hulking figure in plain garments, waited behind the block-axe, in hand its edge dark with age. George's heart thundered in his chest, not with fear alone, but with furious indignation. He had trained his tongue for moments of peril, yet now words faltered on his lips as he knelt, forehead pressed against the rough wood. In that moment a hush fell across the small assembly, a void pregnant with anticipation. George's pulse roared in his ears, drowning out the distant toll of the chapel bell. He could feel the coarse grain of the wood biting into his skin, the slight tremor of the block mirroring his own. His last conscious thought flickered between salvos of memory, the laughter of his sister Anne in happier days, the flourish of his pen as he drafted lines of verse, the triumphant toast raised with courtiers by candlelight. All memories coalesced into a final testament of life before the blade's descent. The executioner's grip tightened on the axe's haft. George's mind surged with a desperate prayer for forgiveness, for absolution, even for mercy, but the prayer dissolved as the blade rose. In the split second before the strike, the world elongated into a crystalline sliver of eternity. The air, the wood, the hush of breath, and the cold glint of steel converged in a single point of awareness. His eyes, once so quick to rove the corridors of power, fixed upon the polished edge as though trying to drill into its very essence. Then came the release, a thunderous crack that shattered the dawn's fragile calm. George's body jolted, a convulsive recoil that spoke of violated flesh and shattered bone. Yet the blade did not fall as cleanly as the sculptor's ideal, nor did the popular myth of one stroke, one life hold. Instead, blood spurted in hot arcs, spraying the block's surface and the surrounding stones. A shudder ran through George's shoulders as the first blow only partially severed his head. Consciousness clung stubbornly at the edge. He felt the pain, sharp, electric, and all-consuming, coursing through his neck and spine. Witnesses later recorded a macabre detail. George's head rolled from the block and came to rest at the executioner's boot, the lips still moving as though calling for aid that could never arrive. The priest recoiled his prayer, stuttering into a gasp. Soldiers stepped back from the spattering spray, uncertain where to look, and for a heartbeat, or perhaps several, George's mind remained entangled in agony emotions, surging unfiltered terror, disbelief, and an elemental urge to draw one final breath. The executioner, face grim, raised the axe again. The second stroke fell with less flourish and greater precision, cleaving through tendons and cartilage until the head came clean. A sudden hush swallowed the courtyard once more, broken only by the distant tolling of the bell. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, lay motionless, his life extinguished in grotesque betrayal. In the aftermath, the reaction was muted but profound. Court whispers spoke not of justice served, but of a spectacle too raw for even hardened minds. Anne, shrouded in her own peril, heard the rumors like thunder rolling at her ears, how her brother's death had been far bloodier than any official account revealed. Factions shifted uneasily. Some saw Cromwell's hand in ensuring no mercy stroke spared George the full horror. Others whispered that Henry himself had ordered the show of brutality to cement his own image of unyielding authority. For a moment the scaffold stood as a testament to power's darkest face, an instrument not just of death but of terror. It reminded all who beheld it that royal favor was fragile, that innocence counted for nothing when ambition demanded blood. And it underscored a grim truth: even the favored could be made into martyrs of spectacle their suffering amplified to serve as warning and entertainment. Yet within that brutal finale lay George's final assertion of humanity. He had refused the hood, declining the illusion of anonymity in death. His agony, laid bare for all to see, became an involuntary testament to the cruelty wielded by those he once called allies. In the raw horror of those moments, the sanitized narratives crumbled, revealing a man stripped of artifice and left only with his consciousness tearing against the blade. As the courtyard emptied and the scaffold was dismantled, the story did not end but transformed. The brutal specifics spread in hushed tones among servants and guards, seeding doubt into the court's polished records. Pain, once confined to the rack and oubliette, now bore witness on the very stones of the tower. And in that transformation, George Boleyn's death transcended mere execution. It became a symbol of power's merciless edge and a caution etched in blood. Thus, the climax of George's ordeal did not close his story, but opened a darker chapter in Tudor history. His body may have fallen, but the violent echo of his last moments resonated through corridors of power, unsettling those who believed they commanded fate itself. And from this point, the ripples of his tragic end would shape events yet to come, leaving an indelible scar on both crown and commoner alike. The morning following the execution lay heavy with a solemn stillness, as though the tower itself mourned George Boleyn's demise. Inside the hall where his body had briefly been displayed, the air hung dense with the coppery tang of blood and the lingering chill of fear. George's head, now sealed in a leaden casket for public exhibition, bore the wounds of that botched first stroke, ragged edges that spoke more of torment than swift justice. Even the crows, drawn by the scent of fresh flesh, seemed reluctant to trespass upon so gruesome a scene. His body, stripped of noble attire and clothed instead in a simple shroud, lay on a low bier beneath flickering torchlight. Servants whispered as they arranged his hands across his chest. The fine rings removed cold iron, binding flesh rather than gilded gold. In the hush, one could almost hear the faint echo of his heartbeat, as if the stones themselves remembered the pulse that once thrummed so proudly. Beyond the chamber doors, the court reacted with muted unrest. King Henry VIII, ever cautious of public sentiment, ordered the removal of any lingering evidence, bloodstains scrubbed from the floor, scraps of the doublet burned. Yet whispers spread faster than any decree. Courtiers spoke in low tones of George's eyes, which witnesses claimed had opened and closed, even as the head lay severed as though in search of forgiveness that would never come. Anne's ladies-in-waiting wept in secret corners, lamenting the fate of a man once painted as villain. Some even questioned the legitimacy of the charges, speculating that the truth had been sacrificed on the altar of political gain. In the days that followed, the Boleyn family's fortunes unraveled. Jane Rochford, George's widow, was confined to a distant manor, her prospects as cold as the damp cell where her husband met his end. Anne, stripped of crown and influence, faced her own execution. In the coming weeks, her sister's ghost haunting every step she took. The void left by George's absence was not only of blood but of spirit. His eloquent voice, once a bridge between warring factions, silenced forever. Yet the true tragedy lay not only in the death itself, but in the moral eclipse it cast upon the realm. Local townsfolk, long accustomed to the grandeur and terror of royal law, began to murmur of injustice. Somber sermons in nearby chapels hinted at the dangers of unchecked power, invoking the specter of George's suffering as a moral lesson. Scholars in Oxford penned tracts debating whether a king who ordered his subject to die in conscious agony remained sovereign of a just realm. Even abroad, ambassadors sent dispatches, some praising Henry's ruthlessness, others decrying the barbarity that stained England's name. Amid these ripples of reaction, George's final moments took on an almost mythical quality. Poets tucked references to his agony into dark sonnets, while pamphleteers circulated broadside verses lamenting a martyr cut down by royal paranoia. The public, seeing the sanitized official reports crumble beneath witness testimony, found in George's death a symbol of collective vulnerability. No longer was execution a private transaction between state and criminal. It became a public reckoning with the fragility of life under an absolute monarch. On the scaffold site, the gray stones were quietly chipped away by pilgrims collecting tokens, small fragments they pressed between prayer books. Each carried a sliver of the brutal truth, proof that beneath the sheen of Tudor pageantry lay a ruthless reality. And so George's body, though buried in consecrated ground far from the Tower, remained ever present in the public conscience, a phantom bleeding into collective memory. In these final hours of reckoning, the question lingered: had George Boleyn's fate been sealed by true guilt or by the darker imperatives of power? The answer, buried beneath wood and stone and blood, escaped easy conclusion. Yet his tragic end forced a reckoning with the cost of ambition, the peril of favor, and the haunting possibility that justice and cruelty are often presented as one and the same. And so, as the torches guttered low and the hall grew silent once more, George Boleyn's story reached its tragic close, yet his legacy, indelibly inscribed in cruelty's ledger, would echo forever. The curtain fell on his final act, but the moral stage remained set, awaiting the consequences that would reverberate for generations. In the aftermath of George Boleyn's execution, the reverberations of his violent end extended far beyond the shadowed walls of the Tower. England's political landscape, once anchored by the Boleyn's influence, fractured into new alignments of power. Courtiers who had whispered in corners now spoke more openly. Alliances were reforged in the wake of a cautionary spectacle that reminded everyone how swiftly favor could sour into fatal accusation. The sharp edge of the axe that cut George's life also cleaved the court into those who sided with Henry's ruthlessness and those who quietly mourned a man sacrificed for ambition's sake. On the streets of London, common citizens debated the morality of a sovereign who permitted conscious suffering. Pamphlets and sermons challenged the notion that royal prerogative justified any method of execution, and for the first time, whispers of legal reform surfaced among the scholars at Oxford and Cambridge. They asked if an executioner's stroke could falter, leaving a victim to writhe in agony. Ought not the law itself demand humanity in administering death? Though no immediate changes came, the question lingered, seeding future calls for more merciful justice. Within the Boleyn family, grief took shape in tragedy. Jane Rochford retreated into a quiet exile, her days haunted by silent halls and memories of her husband's final desperate prayers. Anne Boleyn, once queen and George's beloved sister, faced her own downfall with a grim foreknowledge of the blade's cruelty. The memory of George's incomplete first stroke hovered in her mind like a death knell, warning that mercy was not a virtue Henry granted easily. When her own execution came weeks later, The court's memory of George's ordeal meant that even her hoodless death could not fully conceal the brutality of Tudor justice. Yet despite the sorrow George's story endured, his martyrdom, though unintentional, became a symbol of resistance against tyranny. Poets wove his fate into elegies that circulated in manuscript form. Dramatists alluded to his bloodied testament in early plays about the dangers of absolute power. Foreign ambassadors recorded in their dispatches how the English court's spectacle of conscious decapitation had shocked even seasoned observers in France and the Holy Roman Empire. To them, George's death became emblematic of a reign unmoored from mercy. Centuries later, historians would sift through court records, personal letters, and pamphlets to reconstruct the true horror of that scaffold. Their analyses have linked George's physical agony to broader questions about the relationship between power and humanity. The image of his struggling head briefly clinging to life after the first blow has become a potent metaphor, a final desperate gasp of defiance against injustice. Museums now display replicas of the Tudor executioner's block, alongside medical analyses of decapitation, reminding modern audiences of the fragility of the human body and the corrosive potential of unchecked authority. Ultimately, the chilling truth behind George Boleyn's execution transcends the particulars of Tudor intrigue. It serves as a stark reminder that beneath layers of ceremony and protocol, the machinery of state can inflict unspeakable suffering. His death implores us to question the methods by which societies enforce the gravest penalties and to remember the human cost etched in every scarred stone and bloodied record. In reflecting on his legacy, we confront not only a chapter of Tudor history, but the timeless tension between justice and cruelty, authority and empathy. As the echoes of George's final agony fade into memory, they leave behind an enduring message that power wielded without restraint exacts a terrible toll on human dignity, and that the true measure of a society lies in how it treats even those deemed most guilty.